There are many major endocrine organs that produce various hormones. They include the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, the parathyroid gland, adrenal glands, the pineal gland, the thymus gland, the pancreas, the gonads, which include ovaries or testes, and the hypothalamus. In this diagram, you can see where those different glands are located. So inside of your skull, kind of tucked into your brain, you've got the pineal gland, the hypothalamus, and the pituitary gland. And then sitting on top of your trachea, you have the thyroid gland, parathyroid glands, and the thymus. In your abdomen, you have the adrenal glands and the pancreas, and in the pelvic region, you have the ovaries and the testes. First, we'll talk about the pituitary gland. It's about the size of a pea, and it hangs by a stalk from the hypothalamus in the brain. It's protected by the sphenoid bone of the skull, and it has two functional lobes. There's the anterior lobe, and so that's the anterior pituitary, and it's glandular tissue, and the posterior pituitary is actually made of nervous tissue. And it's often called the master endocrine gland because it impacts so many other endocrine glands. There's 6 different hormones produced by the anterior pituitary gland, and so 2 of them affect non-endocrine targets, and so those include growth hormone and then a hormone called prolactin. And then 4 of those hormones stimulate other endocrine glands. Those are called trophic hormones, and they include thyroid stimulating hormone, or THS, adrenocorticotrophic hormone, and then 2 different gonadotrophic hormones that impact gonads, so impact either ovaries or testes. All of the hormones produced by the anterior pituitary gland are proteins or peptides, which means that they are not made or cannot enter the cells, so they act through a second messenger system, and they're regulated by hormonal stimuli and generally through a negative feedback loop. So in this diagram, you can see the 6 different hormones produced by the pituitary and where they have their function. So growth hormone is functional on bones and muscles. Those are the target tissues. Prolactin has its effect on the mammary gland, so it helps with lactation in females. And then there's also follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. They both impact gonads, the testes and the ovaries. And then thyrotrophic hormone impacts the thyroid, and adrenocorticotrophic hormone, or ACTH, is active on the adrenal cortex. Next, we'll talk about some of the functions of these hormones. So growth hormone is kind of the general metabolic hormone. Its major effects are directed to growing of skeletal muscle and to grow longer bones. It also plays a role in determining final body size. It causes amino acids to be built into proteins, and it causes fat to be broken down as an energy source. There are several disorders associated with growth hormone. One of those is pituitary dwarfism, and that's when you have hyposecretion or decreased secretion of growth hormone during childhood, and so people don't grow as tall as they would with a normal amount of growth hormone being produced. Gigantism results from hypersecretion, so these people have too much growth hormone during childhood, so they generally end up very, very tall. And then acromegaly results from hypersecretion of growth hormone during adulthood. Modern medicine has a pretty good idea of how to control hormone disorders, but this was not always the case. So in this diagram, or in this photograph, you can see the pituitary dwarf, so that's this man right here. And so his body did not produce enough growth hormone when he was a child. And then the guy in the middle has gigantism, so he has too much growth hormone as a child, so he got exceptionally tall. And then there's an average heighted woman in the picture, just so you can kind of see for scale. Prolactin stimulates and maintains milk production following childbirth. It exists in males, but the function is unknown. Adrenocorticotrophic hormone regulates endocrine activity of the adrenal cortex, so that's the adrenal glands. And then thyroid stimulating hormone influences growth and activity of the thyroid gland. There are 2 gonadotrophic hormones that are produced by the anterior pituitary, and so they include follicle stimulating hormone, and that stimulates follicle development in the ovaries and sperm development in testes. And then luteinizing hormone triggers ovulation of eggs in females and stimulates testosterone production in males. The pituitary is closely linked to the hypothalamus, and so hormonal release is regulated by releasing and inhibiting hormones produced by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus produces 2 hormones. The hormones produced by the hypothalamus are transported to neurosecretory cells of the posterior pituitary, and those hormones include oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. The posterior pituitary is not strictly an endocrine gland, but it does also release hormones. So the posterior pituitary produces oxytocin, which stimulates contractions of the uterus during labor and then is also used in sexual relations and breastfeeding. And it also causes milk ejection in a nursing woman, so it works together with prolactin. And then antidiuretic hormone inhibits urine production by promoting water reabsorption by the kidneys, hence antidiuretic. And in large amounts, it causes vasoconstriction, and so that's of your blood vessels. That leads to an increase in blood pressure, and it's also known as vasopressin. So the hormones produced by the posterior pituitary are antidiuretic hormone, which acts on the kidney tubules, and then oxytocin, which acts on mammary glands and uterine muscles. Next, we'll talk about the thyroid. The thyroid is found at the base of the throat, and it consists of two lobes and a connecting isthmus, and it produces two hormones. Those are called thyroid hormone and calcitonin. So here you can see where the thyroid is situated. The hyoid bone, the bone that anchors your tongue, is here, so you can kind of see where we are relative on the throat. And then this is the epiglottis, and that's what blocks off your airway when you're swallowing so that you don't choke. And then situated below that is the thyroid gland, so that's here. And you can see this narrow structure that is between the two sides, that's the isthmus. So thyroid hormone, which is produced by the thyroid, is one of the major metabolic hormones, and it's composed of two iodine-containing hormones. So they're thyroxine, which is secreted by thyroid follicles, and triiodothyronine, which is actually converted to thyroxine at target tissues. There's a couple of major cells that make up the thyroid, so you can see that there's follicle cells, that's all of these little cells here, and then you can see there's also parafollicular cells, which are here. There are some disorders associated with the thyroid gland. If everyone's ever heard of a goiter, it's when the thyroid gland enlarges or swells because of a lack of iodine. We have iodized salt now in most of the salt that we buy, because that way it prevents goiters. It used to be that people who did not eat seafood would be more prone to goiters because there's iodine present naturally in seafood, so people who did not live near oceans were more inclined to get goiters, but with modern nutrition, they're very rare. There's also a disorder called cretinism, and it's caused by hyposecretion of thyroxine, so not enough thyroxine is produced, and it results in dwarfism during childhood. In this image, you can see this woman has an iodine deficiency because the swelling on her throat is a goiter. Another disorder of the thyroid is called myxedema, and it's caused by hypothyroidism in adults, and so it can result in physical and mental sluggishness. And then hyperthyroidism can cause something called Graves' disease, and it results in an increased metabolism, heat intolerance, a rapid heartbeat, weight loss, and exophthalmos. One of the symptoms of Graves' disease is unusual eyes, and so you can see they kind of look like they're bulging, and so that's a pretty typical symptom that Graves' disease is occurring. Calcitonin is another hormone from the thyroid gland. It decreases blood calcium levels by causing calcium to be deposited onto bone. It's an antagonist to parathyroid hormone, so parathyroid hormone releases calcium, and it's produced by parafollicular cells, and those are the cells that are found between the follicles. So we saw this picture before, but the parafollicular cells are the ones that are not attached directly to the follicles. So you can see there's more of them here. There's also a gland called the parathyroid gland, and they're tiny masses on the posterior of the thyroid. They secrete parathyroid hormone. Those stimulate osteoclasts to remove calcium from bone, so they break the bone down to release calcium. They also stimulate the kidneys and intestines to absorb more calcium and raise the calcium levels in the blood.